Recording in progress.
Good morning and welcome to our press conference examining the status of fish populations in Europe, organized here in Brussels by Ifremer, the French National Institute for Ocean Science, and its partner institutions, l'Institut Agro, also from France, ILVO, the Flanders Research Institute for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food from here in Belgium, and the Irish Marine Institute. We have a remarkable panel of speakers with us today who will tell us what's actually going on with fish populations in Europe and how do we know that? How are fish impacted by climate change and how the research could perhaps be better by taking more species into consideration. My name is Denis Loxier. I'm a journalist producing and presenting the Ocean series on Euronews Television. And today I'll be introducing the speakers and passing them your questions. We have more than 40 journalists joining us today online from all over Europe, and our press conference is also available to the general public on social media. So after 4 short keynote speeches, we will have a Q&A session. So please send your questions in the chat for the representatives of the media, or leave the comments under the social media posts for the general public. But first, it's my great pleasure to introduce the CEO of Ifremer, François Houllier, for his opening address.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je suis très heureux de vous accueillir ici dans cette maison Irène et Frédéric Joliot-Curie, qui est la maison française de la science en Europe. L'Ifremer, qui est effectivement l'institut français qui est dédié aux sciences et technologies marines, consacre des moyens qui sont importants à l'étude des ressources halieutiques, à la pêche.
for fisheries and ecological resource. And this morning, we will have some technical and scientific expertise which will support the national policy for fishing. This is a topic we collaborating on with the organisms and institutions across the board from abroad as well. So it is also a topic that sees us collaborate with European instances or international ones, as for instance the International Committee for Ocean Exploration or the Committee for Techniques and Implementation of Fisheries. The first conference happened in 2019. We wanted to present the state of ecological resources and then to speak with scientists about this. So in 2019, 20 and 21, we organized a press conference on a French level to talk about these topics. Last year we had a focus on the Mediterranean Sea, and this year we decided to have a conference with a European span. Why have we decided that? Because fishes move and they're not attached to a particular country for social economical reasons as well. Fishes move throughout European waters, and also for a political reason. There is a common policy for fishing, and so to consider the biomass on a European level would be seem to be interesting. Sorry. France will be president of the European Union for 1.5 months, and so we decided to have a European panel in this year event. We have a lot of methodological questions in terms of fishes populations, also to have some elements on the state of the resource on a European level, and this will bring us to several consideration and questions. For France, for instance, we are present from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. Then we will see the impact of climate change, and then we will consider, can we stop having consideration species by species and have a more general consideration in terms of resources. So I'd like to thank all the people present and listening to us and our colleagues here that will now intervene. Thank you very much.
And before we get to the latest facts and figures and trends in terms of status of fish in European waters, let's first see how this data are collected, how they are produced, and how do scientists know if there are actually plenty of other fish at sea or not. So let me pass the floor to our first keynote speaker, Fisheries Biology Team Lead at Ilvo Marine, the Flemish Scientific Institution, Els Torelle.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yeah. And in fact, we can start with a statement in that way that when you measure, you know things. And when you don't measure, you don't know anything. So when scientists make predictions about the status of the stocks, they need data. No data means no advice. No advice means no informed decisions for managers. Yeah. Collection of data in fisheries and in the marine ecosystem might sound very easy. However, fish do not respect boundaries, and as such, coordination between countries is crucial. Working with experts from other countries gives scientists the bigger picture of what is happening with the fish and with the marine ecosystems in general. But as it is not possible to count every fish or every organism in the marine environment, we use three main sources for collecting data. We have the commercial fishing vessels, there are the research vessels, and the ports where fish is landed. On a national level, the seagoing observers join the commercial vessels, the research vessels, and go to the ports to collect fish samples. From those fish samples, there are some biological measurements done. Yeah. We measure the fish, the length, the weight. There is looked if it's a male or a female. And last but not least, we try to determine the age. Looking at age is in principle quite simple because it's like looking to the rings of a tree. However, it demands a very specific expertise. Fisheries data collection has started from using pen and paper, very simple tools, but has evolved considerably in the last 50 years to the introduction of electronic measuring boards, in innovative techniques like DNA, sensors, artificial intelligence, and so on. Yeah. And this has in fact also significantly changed the fishery sampling of the marine environment. After having collected thousands of records of fish all over different marine regions, yeah, the scientists use their mathematical models to combine all the data to provide an understanding of how populations has evolved and what is the impact of fisheries over the years on the fish populations. However, before we use data, they need to be sorted, they need to have a thorough quality checked, and then they are submitted to a regional organization like ICES, International Council Exploration of the Seas, where then on a regional level, scientists come together in different working groups, depending on the stock that they look at, to make predictions about the stock for the coming years. The ICES is mainly looking to the Northeast Atlantic region and the Baltic regions, yeah, and where the advice is based on the principles set out in international agreements like the Common Fishery Policy. Yeah. Once the advice is produced from the working groups, it is thoroughly checked by an independent peer review, and in the last phase it is submitted to the European Commission. In conclusion, with the data coming from the data collection of fisheries in all different European countries, European scientists advise governments to inform the environmental policy and the regulations to support sustainable development, use and management of marine resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this nice overview. I'm sure there are plenty of questions already. Dear colleagues, please send them in the chat or leave in the comment section. We'll get to them in the Q&A. And as we have just heard, the surveys have advanced greatly over the past half a century in terms of technology and now involve great international cooperation. So what do researchers actually see? What are the latest trends in terms of fisheries in the European waters? To answer that question, allow me to introduce the Deputy Scientific Director of Ifremer, Clara Ulrich, please.
Bonjour. Alors effectivement, la question c'est comment vont les poissons, une question qui peut paraître très simple. Elle, ça a expliqué comment les groupements régionaux de scientifiques produisent des diagnostics sur plusieurs populations de poissons à l'échelle de l'Europe. C'est plus de 150 populations qui sont ainsi suivies chaque année. Et alors, pour pouvoir un peu établir des tendances, un diagnostic un petit peu global, le comité scientifique, technique et économique de la pêche, donc qui est un organisme scientifique de la Commission européenne, rassemble chaque année, en début d'année,
in Europe. We try to create macro trends on how the situation is in Europe. This report in 2022, which was published at the end of March and is now public, what does it say? It says three things. First of all, it says something positive, the situation is getting better. It is a trend, there is a trend in Europe where things are doing better. Fish population are more abundant, fishing pressure is slowing down, it is something positive that we have to remind. But this report also says two other things. The first thing is that this improvement is quite variable, region from region, population from population, and so there are situations where this improvement is quite low. The situation is quite different region by region, and it tells us also that the objective of the common policy for fisheries, which is to attain, to reach MSY, MRB in French, which is a level of exploitation that allows us to tell if the stock is overexploited or not. So what you see in the graph is the regions, the areas where the situation is still more good. And the third thing that this report is telling us is that in this improvement that we see, which is the result of policies implemented, is not a definitive win. There are new menaces arising, about climate change, about policies, and so still a lot of effort has to be done in order to reach a sustainable fishing policy. If we go into the detail of the North Atlantic, for instance, going from the Baltic Sea to Portugal, more or less, you see here there's two graphs. On the left-hand side, the average presence of stock of biomass in respect to the reference of 2003, and you see that this is increasing by more than 40% in the last 10 years. So it's a fundamental trend in the Atlantic region. On the right-hand side, you see the average fishing pressure. And on this graph, we are counting the population that are still overexploited, and these are 28% of populations are considered to be overexploited. Last year, we had 43%, so an improvement in 2020. What you can see in this small graph, there is a stagnation of the level of the average level of exploitation, and then this decrease in 2020, we go underneath the threshold, but you know 2020 was a peculiar year, it was COVID, so it is still too soon to understand if this trend will continue. So if fishing activities have stopped and will continue that way, or if on the other hand they will increase in the future, so we'll have to wait 1 year still to know. In the Mediterranean, the situation is still more difficult because fishing pressure is really high on the species we follow up upon. So on the right hand side, you see that the level of exploitation is 2 times the European threshold. Despite all, we have to notice that there is a slight decrease, and in terms of biomass, so the abundance of fish, on the left hand side, we see an increase in population. It's not comparable with the previous graph. We are on a level of biomass that are lower than what we saw for the Atlantic, but nevertheless, there is a slight improvement in these latter years, and this is the result of things that have changed in the Mediterranean. So the diagnosis is quite positive, but still there are points we need to pay attention to.
Scientific director of Ifremer, and indeed this sounds like not too bad as news, with fish biomass increasing and overfishing declining, at least in some parts of European seas. And I'm sure there will be plenty of questions about that. Leave them in the comments, send them in the chat. But not everything is rosy, as you said, with the apparent difficulties going forward, and some of the gravest are related to the climate change and associated threats. So what are the consequences of climate change on fishery and fishery resources? I'd like to invite our next speaker to elaborate on that. He's the head of the Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences Center of l'Institut Agro in France, Professor Didier Guesquel.
Merci Denis. Bonjour à tous. Oui, les nouvelles du côté de la gestion des pêches sont plutôt encourageantes. Malheureusement, à l'inverse, comme vous l'avez dit, les nouvelles du côté des impacts du changement climatique sont plutôt mauvaises. Alors, pour introduire mon propos, je vais vous montrer cette carte.
Start my introduction, I'd like to show you this chart, this map. This is a forecast issued by mathematical model on the evolution of biomass on a world scale for 2100. And this is worst case scenario. So if we were to continue to produce CO2 without any kind of decrease. What this map says, it is the result of the collaboration of several international institutes. So in the worst case scenario, the quantity of animal biomass, quantity of fishes in the sea will decrease by 20% by 2100, with decrease, with a even more important decrease in tropical areas, for example. This map tells us also that Europe will be impacted a lot. So where this map coming from, where this decrease coming from? Of course, there are processes that are ongoing. The first one is that the physics and chemistry of oceans is changing. Since the climate change is impacting the ocean, we already lost 0.7 degrees Celsius. The sea becomes more acid, it is increased by 30–40% and loses oxygen, which is of course a problem for the biomass. All of this changes in the physics and chemistry of the sea will continue. We know that up until 2040, the oceanic climatic machine has a degree of inertia. So even if we lower immediately the CO2 emissions, what we've done in the past has already created impact. And so the pH of the sea and the temperature will increase up until 2040. This will change the population in the sea, of course. So marine life is directly impacted by that. The first organisms are plankton, vegetal plankton, phytoplankton, and zooplankton, which are the basis of all the food chain allowing for life in the ocean. The abundance of plankton can decrease and the composition can change to the spite of fish species. So fishes will not find their normal food resources and they will find less nutrients. Of course, the organisms that we fish will be impacted as well. They will be impacted individually. We see already some changes in terms of breeding and seasonality, with a more precocious egg laying, which is not on par anymore with the abundance of plankton, and also change in the quality of the eggs. Individual changes in terms of growth. Certain species, they will see their population grow. For instance, the Mediterranean sardine, its average size decreased in the last year by 1 centimeter more or less, and also in weight, of course. There are several phenomena throughout several species in the world, and these species are important not only because they are fished by humans, but they are also used by bigger fishes as food. One of the most spectacular examples is the redistribution of most of marine species towards the pole. Most of the time we speak about migration, but this is not exactly a migration. It's the fact that populations in the south are declining and populations in the north can continue to reproduce. One of the best examples of this is codfish. There's a decline because of probably overfishing in certain area and also across the board because of climate change. And so numbers are declining. At the same time, codfish in the North Sea and the Bering Sea is doing really well. And more globally, it's the whole functioning of the ocean machine, and all the food chains are modified. Things vary from one area to another, but globally we know that we will see a shorter lifespan for species, and a transfer of energy in the trafficking between prey and predator will become less and less efficient. All these phenomena are explaining the changes that we see here. We already lost 5% of the world biomass. All causes considered, we will be -10 in 2040. Then all depends if the Paris agreements are abide to, and we reduce our CO2, things will stabilize. Otherwise, if we don't reduce our emissions, we will go towards the map that you see here. So a decrease by 40% by 2100. And Europe, in all that, we are waiting of an inevitable decrease of 10% in the years to come, and we should be in the world average in between -15 and -20%, which means that independently from the efforts we will have in the future, European fish presence will decrease by 10-15% in the years to come. Of course, will need to adapt. Fishers will have to adapt, and fish management will have to adapt. The European policy for fisheries will have to adapt as well. We will have to discuss new targets, new norms and regulations, and this a new MSY, and massively develop what will be the ecosystemic approach of the ecosystem, to have a more resilient ecosystem. Thank you very much.
The maps and the graphs that we show in this presentation will be shared with the media, so you'll have full access to these infographics for your own reports. And these projections of up to 20% decline in marine life by the end of the century, on average, sound pretty scary. That's, of course, the worst case scenario. But what can we do to not get there, to prevent this worst case scenario? Perhaps with better management based on better science. And one term which we hear increasingly often in relation to that is the subject of our 4 keynote today, after which we'll move on to your question. And the term is the ecosystem-based approach. What is it exactly? Before I introduce our final speaker today, let's watch a quick video to find out. And now to further explain the concept, I'll pass the floor to the principal investigator in ecosystem-based fishery management at the Marine Institute in Ireland, Professor David Reid.
Thank you, Denis. Bonjour. I'm going to tell you today a story of the Irish Sea. It's a story about the fish that live in it, the fishers that catch those fish, the ecosystem they all live in, and the scientists that try and tie that all together, as Denis explained. So I'll start with the history of this place, the Irish Sea. So up till about 1995, it was a classic fisheries ecosystem, plenty of the important fish, cod, haddock, whiting, etc. And then from about 1995 onwards, there was a steady decline in this fishery. So less catch, less biomass in the system. The Northwest Waters Advisory Council to the European Commission made a request to us if we could try and explain what was going on here, and was it something to do with the ecosystem. So as we scientists do, we immediately rushed out and created a model, and I was hoping to have a picture of the food web model on the screen. So a food web is simply a straightforward map, if you like, of the relationships between organisms in the sea and who eats who, most particularly. And as you can see from the figure, it goes right from the bottom, where you're looking at phytoplankton, plants, and zooplankton, right up to top predators like whales and indeed ourselves. It also includes information on fishing activities. It includes information on the ecosystem, most notably temperature and food availability. However, it's not perfect. We wanted to set up this model running from 1975 onwards, because that gives you a much better picture of what's going on. And we didn't know much about the diet of fish back in 1975. Not many people know that. But the fishermen know that because they had the fish on their decks. And we wanted to know what the fishing pattern was like, what the gear they used, where they went, how much activity there was, right back to 1975, even though we only had data back to 2000. So we set up this model and ran it. It took about 2 years' work. And basically what we found, very quickly and simply, was that if we just used I'll call it science data, without any of the ecosystem or the fisherman's stuff, we got an okay model. It was able to predict some of what we had seen, but by no means all. When we included the information from the stakeholder, it improved a great deal. So now we were able to predict what had happened better, map with what we actually saw. And finally, when we put in the ecosystem drivers, such as temperature and food availability, the model was much more robust, much more statistically significant, and explained a lot more of what went on. We had three major findings from this, and I'll sort of reprise those from what I talked about before. So one of the key things is that modelling with the fishers, with the stakeholders in the system, was really productive and very helpful. Secondly, if you use ecosystem variables in the model, it works even better than just using that scientific data. And what the final finding is that the system would probably have recovered through the management measures that were introduced, the reduction in effort. Some fleets reduced effort by up to 90%. The system would probably have recovered if the ecosystem hadn't been moving into a low productivity phase. So the question that's often asked of me when I make these presentations is, so what? That's lovely science, we've explained what happened, but can we do anything with it? So we have a management using maximum sustainable yield in Europe, which Clara talked about before. That maximum sustainable yield is a point estimate, a single number, but it also has ranges around it. So you can still fish somewhat above it or somewhat below it. And that's what we call pretty good yield. It's still precautionary, it's still fully sustainable, it's still ecologically viable, but it allows us a range to move within. And what we developed to make this operational was to apply a target fishing mortality that depended on the productivity of the system, as I've illustrated with the food web model. And so if it was a good year or a good period, you would have a slightly higher fishing mortality. You could support a slightly higher fishing mortality. If it was a poorer year, low productivity, you'd reduce the fishing mortality in compensation. And so one of the things we were able to do then with our model was simulate what would have happened over the last 20 years if we'd operated that way. And the great result, the good news, is that what we've ended up with is, on average, a higher biomass of our main fish populations, and at the same time, a higher yield for the fishermen, which is the classic win-win that we're always looking for. And we retain a sustainable and resilient ecosystem. So the take-home message from all this is that it's really quite difficult to manage fisheries and fishing activity if you don't also know about what's going on in the ecosystem, because the two things interact. And so that's the key thing about ecosystem-based fisheries management. Thank you very much.
Thank you for making this clear. And I'd like to thank all the four panelists for their presentations. And now it's time for your questions. Our Q&A section will include a number of questions we have received in our chat from the members of the media and some comments from our social media platforms. So let's begin with the question on the best case scenario. So we talked about the worst case scenario in the long term, but what's the best case scenario? Aurélie Demes is asking, is that stabilization at minus 10% of the biomass? Is that more or less accurate? Or can we possibly reverse what we are projecting now?
Non, malheureusement, aucun des scénarios ne prévoit pour l'instant de remonter des biomasses en liaison avec le changement climatique. Vous avez ici des figures complémentaires à ce que j'ai montré. La figure de gauche, vous avez
complementary figures. On the left-hand side, you see a graph. You see a decrease. All the graphs decrease up until 2040, and you see in 2040 the two graphs diverge. So you have the worst case scenario and the best scenario. If we manage not to increase the temperature over 0.5 degrees, we would have the best scenario, but in this case we will have a stabilizing effect, a stabilization of the effect. You see that in the blue curve, in the green curve. But then if we do not manage to lower our emissions, we will continue the decrease. These forecasts are done on the basis of fishing continuing as we did up until today, no reduction in fishing. But we've seen in the previous presentation that by better managing fisheries and fishing, we can increase the biomass. So, of course, in terms of climate change, we need to stop the emissions to keep the status quo, let's say, but then through a better management of fishing, we can increase the stocks. That's why it's interesting to think on the ecosystem level, as our colleague from Ireland explained, because the ecosystems are impacted by all these climate change and fishing pressure. So through lowering the emission, we can maintain the static quo, and through a better management of fishing, we can...
Right now, do we already see, that's another question coming from the social media, do we already observe any effects of climate change on fishing today? And personally, I'm wondering how those effects, positive or negative for the fisheries economy. Maybe one of you could answer this question.
Oui, le changement climatique n'est pas une menace. C'est une menace, mais c'est déjà une réalité. C'est-à-dire qu'une partie des effondrements
is already impacting our ecosystem. What we see in terms of decrease of biomass and stock is directly the result of climate change. Of course, it's difficult because there are a lot of variables involved. Nature is something that is really complex. Scientists have a hard time to keep into consideration all the specificities together. And inversely, there are some species that are doing better. Hopefully, the increases do not offset the decrease for the moment. And there is another aspect which is quite important. When the climate change, the climate becomes more and more unstable. Here in Brussels today, we have a storm, for instance, and it's not the season. You can see that in the sea as well, population and in fish population. Fish population become more and more volatile, more and more unstable, and they change directly as an impact of climate change. And that's a problem for fishers because, of course, in order to fish, you need a vessel, you need a lot of investment. If the environment is so volatile. To complete on that, the situation today is the combination of several factors. We are getting out of this historical part of this part of our history where the main impact on fish population was overfishing, but today we don't have only that, because we've seen some improvements through policies implemented allowing to decrease the fishing pressure, but we still have this historical fact, and added to that we have to add the climate change effects, bringing to a situation today where we have the combination of historical overfishing, climate change, and fish management, which changed a lot in the last years through the policies implemented. So it is difficult to point a finger and to say it is this fault or this other fault. But today's situation is a mix of all these causes.
Many questions regarding the climate-related projections. Some of them will probably be answered by journalists receiving the detailed graphs, but just maybe we can quickly clarify. When we talk about the loss of 5% and other numbers of the biomass, what is the reference period? Loss compared to when?
Alors, les 5%, c'est, vous avez sur le graphe, c'est le niveau 0, c'est la période actuelle. Donc on calcule ça par rapport à une fenêtre de temps.
To a time window. Recent years, I don't know the timing right now from off the top of my head, but if you look at the graph, the graph starts in 1950s. And the decrease started in the 90s, 2000s. So this is the reference time frame. So of course there is a level of uncertainty in this forecast, but we can see a steep decrease starting from the 90s.
Knowledge about fish stocks, in particular the UK waters, are they included or are they excluded from these estimations? We're talking about European waters. Are British waters considered European in your perspective?
Alors, oui, là, dans les graphes que je vous ai montrés, les eaux anglaises et les populations anglaises sont encore incluses. Population anglaise, en fait, c'est un mauvais terme, parce qu'effectivement, c'est...
Those are still included because it includes all the populations on which the European level has fishing, the European Union has fishing activities. So some spaces, some areas are shared in between UK and Europe, other are fished in by European fleets. I'm talking not only about UK and Europe, but the North Sea, Montenegro Sea, and so on and so forth. So we are taking into consideration all the waters that are fished on by European fleet.
And just add to that, since the Brexit, in fact, there's also a memorandum of understanding between ICES and the third countries, not only the UK, but also what Clara refers to Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, so that there is a continuation with the collection of the needed data and also submitted to the respective regional organizations so that the stock assessments and the biomass evolutions can be monitored at any time and in a continuously way.
Professor Reed?
Yeah, just to give the example of the Irish Sea, when the Irish Sea is half UK, half Ireland, and the collaboration, the team that did the work that I showed earlier is a collaboration between Ireland and the UK. We also had people from Belgium and France involved. So we can still do the science despite Brexit. I'm British, so but work in Ireland, so I see both sides of that dilemma.
All right, I think that this answers these questions. What about the visible effects of climate change on the European fishery? Today, the journalists keep asking these questions. Sandy Dauphin is asking, does the climate change already affect population size of fish, and in particular migration? Maybe we could repeat a little bit about this.
Oui, donc j'ai parlé de l'exemple de la morue, donc ça affecte. Mais je peux rappeler l'exemple de la sardine, de Méditerranée, quand chacune des sardines, au lieu de peser 30 grammes, pèse 10 grammes, c'est la quantité totale de biomasse de tonnes de sardines.
You can imagine on a total level in terms of biomass, how can that have an impact? Of course, this is a disaster for sardine fisheries. And that effect goes for all the fishes using sardine as food, for instance, tuna, and so on and so forth. So fishes are already impacted by climate change. In terms of migration, I said it already, we talk about migration from the south to the north, and the same goes for fish. We can observe an effect of migration. We call it migration, but this is not the massive impact. The massive impact is the fact that reproduction, breeding slows down in southern parts of Europe, especially where water becomes too hot for them. And you have the opposite effect in the North Sea, in the Baltic Seas, and so on and so forth. And so southern species have a harder time in respect to northern species to breed and reproduce because of the temperature of the water. Maybe just to complete, CEIM produced in 2017 or 2018 a report on which populations we already see where distribution is and displacement is quite visible. And in the North Atlantic, we called them big movers. There were 8 species that had been seen as big movers. We had so these pelagic fishes, which are in mid-water, in between two waters, and they displace. There are already some really important displacements, and they live parts of the year in cold waters and parts of the year in hot waters. But there are other populations that are a lot more attached to a narrower area. They don't have this habit to move as much, and that is what has changed, because we see a decrease in the population instead of a geographical displacement. So that is to say
Thomas Schroeder, the main goal of the CFP, Common Fisheries Policy, was to end overfishing by 2020. We are at 2022 now. So what are the main reasons that there are still so many stocks fished over the MSY? Who could answer this question? Who is to blame?
Oui, alors je ne peux pas répondre. Nous, on va faire des réponses de scientifiques. Hein. Bien sûr, c'est pas nous qui sommes aux commandes, mais je pense que voilà, ça n'échappera à personne que finalement, quand on part d'un point A à un point B,
When we talk from a point A and we have to get to a point B, the road is long, and each step is important and costly in terms of revenue for the fish, in terms of fish supply. So there is always this economical and financial pressure on the fishing environment to continue to produce and to continue to carry forward the markets. To get to a point A to a point B, you always have to compromise in between environmental objectives and economical and financial objectives. That's why all the policies are hard to implement. And to get to today's situation, it is a sum of some small steps, some longer steps. We can always say that things are not moving as fast as we would like, but at the same time, we have to say that they are moving in the right direction. As a scientist, is difficult to put ourselves in the shoes of the policymakers. I'd like to add to that. If we had told to our scientists 20 years ago that we wanted to decrease by 50% overfishing, that we wanted to increase the biomass by 40%, scientists would have said at that time it is impossible. So what the last 15 years showed us is that when you want, you can implement measures following scientific advice and lower the fishing pressure. And the second thing that we can see is then when you do, you can see then the result. So I think that we started the change, we changed the paradigm, we made a lot of progress, and now we're getting to the end of our tether, to the end of we can do through these measures, and we need to implement additional measures or different measures, also taking in consideration the impact of climate change. So we do not have only to consider overfishing right now, we have to consider the two things combined.
Mentioned is that attempting to achieve MSY just by managing individual fish stocks is always going to have problems because you don't know all the other things that are going on that are driving those stocks up or down. I hope the others haven't already said this. And so you would, if you're not going to include ecosystem drivers in your understanding, you're always going to have some stocks which will slip below MSY because you're not doing that. So as we move to more ecosystem-based fisheries management, we're going to avoid those mistakes as well. So I hope that adds to the story.
Yes. For now, sometimes it looks like the fully sustainable fisheries is the horizon. You go in that direction and it recedes at the same speed. But one of the most obvious measures which journalists are asking about is reducing fishing quotas. So a question from Soliane Arnal on social media: do you think that fishing quotas could be reduced over the coming years to get closer to that objective?
Can I just, sir, I can't stand not talking. I think the point is that that's exactly what we do. We reduce fishing quotas if the fishing mortality is too high, and when it's not too high, below the level, we can then increase it. So yeah, we already do exactly that. But each time, the situation then has to be re-evaluated, and then you impose another set of quotas. So it's not simply just a question of reducing all the quotas all the time. That will probably deliver your targets, but it will also reduce all the other things you're interested in.
Oui, je crois que les quotas ont vocation... malheureusement, on est obligé de les baisser quand les populations s'effondrent. Mais à l'inverse, quand les populations se portent mieux, les pêcheurs peuvent en partie en bénéficier. Alors je dis en partie parce que
we have to decrease the quotas, but then when the stock increases, we can change. What we can do is to maintain captures in the areas that allow that, but then we need to follow up closely on that. that. We want to continue to fish as much as we can, but having a lower impact on the ecosystem. And data shows that that is possible. If fishes are more numerous, fishes are happier, and they can continue to work.
In fact, it's not only about indeed the fishing. Yeah. It's about much more than only the fishing sector going for a certain yield and linked to a quota. You have a whole different set of players who also have an impact on your marine environment. Yeah. So that brings us always back to the story of the ecosystem-based approach. Yeah. And okay, the ecosystem-based approach for fisheries management is maybe not a goal in itself, but it's a way how we can achieve a better management of the marine environment in its total. Yeah. We have the fish, but we have all the other organisms in that marine environment that need to be taken into account. Yeah. So sticking always to the idea of lowering the quota will help the overfishing, and we will, as a scientist, give you the solution for having a good management of the marine environment is honestly not enough anymore. And we have evolved to that knowledge now. Yeah. That has been building up knowledge, building up the expertise takes time. And then I come back a little bit to my point of the talk, that it's the data collection. Yeah. You need to collect your data not only of your fish itself, of your single stock, but you need to have your data of the whole marine environment. Yeah. You need to have your temperature, your depth, your salinities, all the different stuff that are there in the ocean. Yeah. And then we come up to the story of the big data, yeah, where you have not only the data from a scientist, but also the data from your fishing sector. Yeah. A fishing vessel is a huge source of data that, combined with your marine scientific data, can give partly an answer to how to manage your ocean for the future.
Perhaps, Professor Reed, you could add, would the ecosystems-based approach have a great effect on how we assign fishing quotas?
Yes, it could do. But it very much depends on what your objectives are. So if your objective is to protect a particular organism other than the commercial fish, and to do that you could do that by reducing fish quotas, then that would be a possibility. But it's not a simple link. It's not just if we reduce the quota on cod, we'll have more dolphins. It's not that simple. So the food web that I showed you before is the tool to work out how to do it. So you need to know all those interactions to know whether your action will lead to a given result. And that's the key difficulty here. Is there are very few, if I pull this lever, that thing will go up. It doesn't work that way. You can often get perverse results where you pull the lever intending to reduce something and you actually increase it accidentally. So it's the usual scientist's answer, it's complicated, and you need to understand that complexity.
All right, moving on to the next question. François Manet is asking, what do you think of the fact that bottom trawling in marine protected areas is still not banned?
Alors c'est un grand débat qui vient certainement du fait qu'il y a un décalage aujourd'hui entre le fait qu'on a beaucoup étendu les aires marines protégées, avec souvent, il faut le reconnaître, des niveaux de protection
with a weak protection most of the time. Protected marine area are not homogeneous. We can have several for different reasons, but there is a deficit in terms of protection norms in the protected areas. So when we see today that we go towards 30%, there are areas where bottom trawling that has a lot of impact. impact in the bottom of the sea is only allowed in smaller areas. So, of course, there is no understanding from the public, and there is a level of not understanding on the part of the scientists as well. Some areas exist to protect birds, for instance, and if the protected marine area is to protect the birds, there's no reason to forbid bottom trawler fishing. There are other areas where the area has been created, rightly so, to avoid bottom trawler fishing, and in this case, it is allowed. So we need to stop identifying all these areas as marine protected areas and start working on a case-by-case basis. Of course, we also have to say that this is just a tool among others, is not a target, an objective in itself. We need to see what we are looking for. We are looking for more resilient ecosystem protection where is needed. So we always have to get back to what's the objective and what's the best means to attain our objectives. So we don't need to be dogmatic about it. There is not only black and white. And as my colleague was saying, has to be done on a case-by-case basis, and also having really clear the objective you want to attain. Scientists have a more and more precise idea of the fishing pressure for any given area, and we also have special information about the sensitivity of the population, so we know where there is this, let's say, difference in between the fishing activities and sensitive areas to be protected. So we always have to go back to what it is, what do we want to achieve, and what happens if we stop fishing activities. So there are consequences on every level. If you close an area, fishers will move to another area, and maybe by avoiding the impact on the area, you will have created an impact on another area. So every time you have to consider, if I close this area and make it a marine protected area, where will fisheries move? Where will fishing activities move? Of course, if you stop bottom trawling and then you have illegal activities during the night on the neighboring area, you haven't gained much. So, of course, we always need to implement these considerations in our studies. And finally, having 100% on the surface where the ecosystem allowed for fishing. We do not only want to take care of marine protected areas. These are, of course, paramount. It is a tool which is absolutely important for us, but still, in areas where fishing is sustainable, we have to exploit as much as we can.
More complete data. A quick question from Tom Isebert. Do you have data on bycatch? So is bycatch included in your estimations?
Yes, so we have observer programs on most of the commercial fleet, which records everything that's caught, and some of which is bycaught. Often depends what you mean by bycatch. We tend to cut it into two categories: bycatch of endangered, threatened species, the mammals and so on, and then the bycatch of other fish or juvenile fish. So you've got all that; it's all recorded. It's not every trip, but it is recorded. Yes.
Dr. Torelle, anything to add?
Yes, I can only confirm what Professor Reid is referring to. Within the data collection framework, which is in fact also an European legal framework that obliges every member state to collect the data on fisheries. Yeah, the collection on bycatch is included. Yeah, so it is an obligation for every member state. Yeah, historically the focus was mainly on the fishes that were not allowed to catch, or the smaller fishes, the juveniles. Those recently. It has broadened, and it's also the protected endangered species. Whenever it's caught into the nets, it's registered. Protected species that need to be put immediately back into the sea, that's also taken care of. So they're registered that they are caught, but they're immediately put back into the water in the sea so that they can survive and continue. There are also systems in place to have some species proactive protected. Yeah, there are some what we call pingers, which are used on some mammals. Yeah. So yeah, there is a whole system coming into place, not only to monitor the bycatch, but also to make sure that they're not always caught.
Just one thing to add to that is that we're also recording all the fish that we don't land commercially. And are not sold at all, but are still being implicated in the fishery. And I think that's really important when you think about the food web that I showed you before. We take, in the Baltic Sea, we take about 20 species commercially, and in our surveys we'll see 200 species, something like that. So most of those fish that are in the net are not actually fish that are going to be commercially landed. It's important to know what happens to them too.
And just to indeed further complete it, we have data collection on the commercial vessels, yeah, but there's also on the research vessels. And on the research vessel, you have firstly you do your catch in different places than a commercial vessel, yeah, because you need to balance a little bit where a commercial fisherman was fishing and where some data was collected. So on the research vessel, you have your commercial species, you have your non-commercial species, you even have your litter, you have your bentos, you have the whole load of what is caught in a certain place. Yeah. And all those data are also stored in databases and can be used for your ecosystem-based modeling and for your data story.
A question from social media. When analyzing fisheries and their impact, do you make a separation between industrial fishing, intensive fishing? Here the viewer asks about bottom trawling that, as she says, destroys the marine life at the seafloor. And artisanal fishing, other forms of sustenance fishing, in terms of their effect on the fish populations and biodiversity in general. Do you make any difference between the two, or do you assess them together?
Alors, en partie, on les évalue ensemble. C'est-à-dire qu'un poisson qui est tué, peu lui importe d'être tué par un très gros bateau ou un très petit. Donc, dans la partie évaluation, ce qu'on appelle entre nous l'évaluation des stocks.
So in the assessment part, assessment of the stocks, what we look at is the total capture, and we sum it up for the different vessels. Of course, this is not the whole of the question. The question is the ecosystem impact, the impact on the bottom of the seas. And this, the impact also depends on the size of the vessel. Some vessels that are considered to be artisans use bottom trawling, others don't. So when we need to have these consideration, the size and the way, the fashion of fishing of the vessel is important. There is a last chapter on the question. Inversely, the economical and social impact of fishing and other activities are not it's all the same. I don't want to delve into too much detail on this evaluation, but there are real economical and political debates on the sharing of the richness of the oceans. Do we want to have a small fleet, easy to manage and to control, or do we want to leave more of an open option? But this question is more political and societal rather than being linked to ecosystemic considerations.
I think the question is trying to ask, and is bottom trawling something that we should control, and artisanal fishing is something we shouldn't. And I think that very much depends on the situation you look at. If you look at places in the African lakes, for instance, artisanal fishing has had the same sort of scale of impact on the ecosystem as we would expect to see in our bottom trawled water. So it's not a question of what the particular fishery is viewed as. It's a question of what your objectives are, and those objectives are ecosystem objectives and social and economic, and you have to balance all those. It's a trade-off. I think that's what Didier was saying, but it's worth reiterating. No decision you make is independent of other things you think are important.
Thomas Schroeder is asking for, if possible, to give a bit more examples and maybe numbers, if you have this data, in terms of bycatch by individual stocks that are doing particularly well or not. Do we have that, or is it beyond the scope of this press conference?
Oui, alors effectivement, c'est une très bonne question parce que les variations sont énormes. Elles sont énormes à la fois d'une réponse de scientifique, c'est complexe. Les variations sur une
or not. The variations are really different from one region to another, from one method of fishing to another, from one species to another. So it is difficult because the reply may vary in a couple of kilometers, so it's difficult to have a simple answer. Globally, the estimates is about 10% of what we call bycatch and reject. In Europe, we were beyond this world average because we have a big diversity in terms of species. We have a lot of mixed fishing. When we want to catch one fish, we end up catching a lot of different species. This is not the case everywhere, but it's the case in Europe. And also because the common fishing policy has this system of sharing. This is something that we share, and parts are not equal. So from one region to from another, from one fisher to another, some have rights, some have certain rights, some do not, and we find ourselves with a system in Europe that create bycatch, create reject, because sometimes we catch a fish that is that we can eat, but we cannot sell it because it does not respond to all the characteristics. To go back to examples, traditionally we have some bottom trawling activities those are the ones that create the larger number of bycatch.
Et qui a une forte valeur commerciale. La plie, c'est un gros poisson qui a une faible valeur commerciale, et donc forcément on attrape le petit, et en attrapant le petit, on attrape le gros. Et donc les taux les plus forts, ça pouvait monter jusqu'à 50%.
And trying to catch flounder, we end up catching as a bycatch small fishes that are not sellable, that you cannot sell. On stocks, nevertheless, that are quite numerous, so there is not a danger for the population. In many of our bottom trawling fleets, we have rates between 20 to 40%, depending on the species in terms of bycatch. We have a variation in between 15 and 30%, and we have a lot of other methods of fishing to capture mackerel, for instance, that will be inferior to 5%.
20 minutes till the end of this Q&A session, and the questions keep coming in. We'll try to answer as many as possible here at this panel, and after that, journalists can talk to individual panelists directly in private chat rooms. Please wait for that. But for now, would the enforcement of fishing control and video control and the enforcement of landing obligation lead to further improvements, asks Thomas Schroeder. So I will add that we have mentioned the observer program, but often we hear that only good boats allowed observers on board. Maybe we don't get the full understanding. So what about video control? What about enforcement of fishing control and landing obligation? Is this something that we need to do to improve the situation?
I can have a quick start just to let the others go. I think one of the things that you sort of have to remember is it's impossible to impose really heavy-duty controls on people who don't want them. And we know this is a societal thing. You can't impose a law if the bulk of the people that law is imposed on do not wish to comply with it. So it's not a question of imposing or controlling, it's a question of achieving compliance by willing compliance. And so you need to be able to make it understandable by fishermen in a way that makes them want to comply with it. It's a difficult thing to say, but if you force them to do one thing, they'll think of another way around it. There's always this classic thing of if you pass one, 4 or 5 of us think of a regulation, and 500 people outside are thinking of ways around it. So you have that difficulty of imposing something that is not welcome. I'll let the others.
Can we really count on the benevolence of fishers who are in tough economic situation, have to compete with others who don't necessarily follow the same rules? That's the question.
Yeah, it's complex.
Oui. Alors, moi, je partage complètement ce que vient de dire Dave. Peut-être on peut d'abord dire une chose, c'est que la pêche aujourd'hui, globalement, est une activité très contrôlée. Les pêcheurs doivent remplir en permanence des journaux de bord électroniques, des contrôles.
Activity. Fishers have to write logs and to give a lot of information. So we implemented a really efficient system. Of course, there are some issues that create problems. For instance, the landing obligation is not respected by all. I think that the greatest challenge is to make fishers understand that what we are doing goes in their interest as well. And they are the main beneficiaries for cultural reasons, complex reasons. Fishers in the north of Europe tend to better accept the idea that on-board embarked cameras will help them to do their work better. I see that Dave is saying his thinking is not as easy as that, but anyway, the idea of being permanently filmed is not accepted well by all, as fishers have understood that this goes in their interest, and since they are virtuous practices, they need to push others to implement them. I have the impression that things are doing better. 10 years ago, we could not imagine a camera aboard any French vessel. Today, we have fishers starting in this process because they do understand that by doing that, they will start to show that they abide by environmental rules, they have an eye and an attention for the environment, and so things are getting better in that sense. And the main example where things work starting from a fisher initiative is the West Canada, small fishing vessels as we do. Chile is another place where things are doing bottom up with a system that is accepted by fishers. And why? Because the way fishers tell the story, I heard it told by Canadian fishers, and they say, thanks to the camera, I know that I'm abiding the law and the rules. And this creates a more virtuous system where the documentation, where video replace the documentation, because there are ways to log to change the logs of what you caught, but through video all is clear, and so impact is better managed. So documentation allows sometimes to reduce controls because we know what you do, and you will have this information. Once again, this is a change on a and is more on the control if we don't know.
Indeed, I think there's a bit of a scientific challenge, also, because now when we do an assessment of a stock or for the ecosystem, it is with a bit of a retardation. You know, we collect the data in this year, there is a forecast next year, and it's applied 2 years later. So the fishermen then sometimes get frustrated, but if you would give the fishermen some tools that they have a quicker and an immediate access to what is ongoing in the marine world or in the ecosystem with the fish stocks, they would definitely use a camera and other tools to avoid the stocks that they are not allowed to fish. Currently, there are already some projects ongoing, where they look for using the data on a fishing vessel combined with biological data to be given to the fishermen to have like a direct management. And as the three colleagues here state, if you give your fishermen the tools for direct management, you will need probably a less control because they'll manage in a proper way.
Another question, what are the remaining stocks that are overexploited nowadays? I suppose there are too many, but what are the most worrisome ones?
C'est une question, c'est vrai, ça va être, la liste est longue parce que c'est vrai que voilà, ça varie, et c'est vrai qu'on peut avoir côte à côte au même endroit, dans les mêmes pêcheries, des populations qui vont bien et d'autres qui vont moins bien. Donc voilà, c'est un peu difficile de dire c'est telle espèce ou telle zone.
Difficult to say, is this area or this species? So you need to look at all the detailed information. If journalists are willing to ask a particular question, we can help them to find the answers. If you're talking about sardine or cod or another species, we do have information about all of this. It is true that we see stocks that are undergoing more difficulties, and as Didier was saying, they suffer for other things as well. We talked, for instance, about codfish in several areas where codfish codfish number were numerous in the past, and they are not right now because of all the things we explained. Waters become hotter, there is less breeding of the species. So because of these facts, there are populations that are doing really well and other populations that are doing not that well. But anyway, we see modification in the presence on historical areas. The average of the population has moved to more recent exploitation, whilst in the North Sea or the Baltic Sea, let's talk about the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is a precursor of what will happen to us. Despite good management in the Baltic Sea, there has been a crumbling of the species and the numbers, and all the Baltic population are really impacted by a change to the ecosystem. Fishes have a hard time living in the Baltic, and in the North Sea, we start to see that species having a hard time to breed and live because there is less oxygen, there is less food. There is an element that can explain the conservative approach of the scientist.
Or, en fait, la population de sol du
One
Golfe, oui, actuellement, elle est surexploitée. Mais il y a d'autres populations à d'autres endroits qui se portent bien.
If we are talking about, for instance, the sole, the flounder in the Gascogne Sea, people will only hear the name of the fish and will not consider that this is a particular species in a particular area. I refuse normally to talk about species because in the same area there can be the same species overfished or underfished.
Long before we got here. That's a natural thing that goes on. There's cycles between species. One species will come into dominance and another one will fall away. That's really normal stuff. And what we then end up doing is we add a certain increase in pressure to that. And so any one time you're going to expect one or two stocks and whatever will always be, to us, what looks like they're in trouble. And they probably are. But the ecosystem, for me, the question is really, is the whole ecosystem healthy? And would that then create the situation where those stocks could recover in the future? If you create a situation where a stock declines and it cannot recover, that's when you have to worry. Whether it's in a cyclical up or down is much less worrying.
We only have 5 minutes left, and before we wrap up, there's a lot of interest regarding the statistics for Northeast Atlantic, where the trends seem to be positive. And the question is, why? Why do we see that difference between Northeast Atlantic and other European waters, apart from COVID? Asks Tom Isebert. And could you elaborate on what species are doing well in the Northeast Atlantic and what species are not? And we have to make it really short.
Alors, je ne vais pas répondre sur les espèces parce que je pense qu'on vient d'y répondre. Après, sur l'Atlantique Nord-Est, il faut vraiment repartir de l'histoire et se dire que la politique de la pêche est née dans l'Atlantique Nord-Est.
Fishing policy started there. These are considerations that started in the 70s up to the 90s. We can say there have now been great progress, but starting from the year 2000, there is this acknowledgement, this awareness. For instance, the first ruling on of codfish was in 2001, and then there was a new revision in 2004, and so forth. So the policy that we have today throughout Europe were the results of the studies and consideration that started in the year 2000 and started in the Northeast Atlantic. That's why we see this need of time. When you implement a solution, you need time before you see the results, and at the same time, if you stop implementing the solution, you can see the situation degrading quite quite fast. You need to continue the efforts on the long term. Mediterranean is a complete different story because of its history. There was less of exchange, less of sharing from one country to another. And this European integration of the management is more recent in the Mediterranean respect to the North Atlantic. The common policy for fishing is arrived in the Mediterranean in 2013. This area was not covered before. So what we are implementing right now is what was implemented in the Northeast Atlantic in the year 2000. So we will have probably the same effects, but 20 years later. And to complete is also that we have implemented a quite rigorous quotas, fishing quotas. I don't know if you can have the map. This is implemented across the board, but apart from the Baltic Sea, where there are some systemic effects, there is no quotas that are not respected. What is quite emblematic is the red tuna population. 10 years ago, we didn't have any data on these populations. There are still some populations that we don't know well, but we are making progress quite so fast.
Plenty of questions we didn't have time to answer, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. My sincere thanks to all the participants of this panel for sharing their knowledge and their perspectives with us today. Members of the press can remain online to ask their remaining questions directly to our panelists. And our viewers on social media, please leave your comments and share this recording with your followers. I'd like to thank Ifremer and all the partner institutes for organizing this press conference today. I'd like to thank our technical team who ensured this live broadcast in very difficult technical circumstances, and the interpreters who worked with us today. Once again, big thanks to all the participants, both here and online. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye from Brussels.